Hello everyone, thank you for tuning into this presentation for the Festival of Road Safety. My name is George Beard and I'm Head of New Mobility at TRL, the UK's Transport Research Laboratory. The title of my presentation today is Why We Need to Think Smaller. To begin then, a very quick introduction to TRL for those who are not aware of us. TRL is an independent research organisation with around 250 employees, headquartered in Berkshire. And together we share a vision for clean, efficient transport that is safe, reliable and accessible for everyone. Our work to realise this vision is centred around the 6 strategic themes shown here. And my area of responsibility is new mobility, which is fundamentally about looking at how we can do things differently. How can we harness new technologies and business models to provide better ways of moving people and goods? So in this presentation, I'm going to consider 3 very simple questions in the context of our transport system. Number 1, where have we come from? Number 2, where have we got to? And number 3, where do we need to go? Starting with that first question then, let's consider where we have come from in terms of the evolution of our transport system. Now, in the interest of time, I've honed in on a few key areas of automobility, walking and cycling. Looking back to the 1950s then, there were around 4 million licensed vehicles in Great Britain, and about 14% of households had access to a car or van. And it was from this point when mass motorisation really took off. Between 1950 and 1970, there was rapid expansion of car ownership, increasing 5-fold over that period. And at the same time, there was an accompanying expansion of road haulage and motorised public transport, with buses typically replacing trams over the course of the 1950s and 60s, and the numbers of lorries also doubling over this period, with new large variants of heavy goods vehicle over 8 tonnes becoming more commonplace. And to support this new motor age, considerable investment in infrastructure was required, and the new construction of motorways began. The first extended length of the M1 was opened in 1959, for example, and Britain achieved the first 1,000 miles of motorway in 1972. Now, whilst walking was the most common form of transport for most of the 20th century, the onset of mass automobility after 1950 meant that walking became more hazardous, especially in built-up areas. Walking as a means of transport also became increasingly more invisible in planning, while motorways were built to accommodate the traffic. Walkers were forced into subways, onto bridges and raised walkways away from roads. Cycling also saw similar declines in the face of growing competition from these motorised automobiles, particularly the privately owned cars. And by the late 1940s, when the number of bicycles in the UK had reached its peak, when cycling was second only to the bus as the most common means for people to get to work. After 1950, bicycle kilometres fell quite rapidly, and falling from about 18 billion kilometres to around 5 billion vehicle kilometres in the 1970s. So while this is just a very small snapshot of the technological developments and trends that occurred in our recent history, the message is that the last century saw rapid growth in personal mobility, largely driven by the developments in automobiles, making private car ownership an affordable and convenient option for the mass market. And this trend continued to the modern day. So here we are now, we have 38 million licensed vehicles in Great Britain, and around 79% of households now have access to at least one car or van. And actually about half of those households, 36% of the total, have access to 2 or more cars. And as shown by this figure, cars now represent the vast majority of vehicles on our roads. And this car dominance is further illustrated through national travel data. So the DfT's National Travel Survey paints a very useful picture here in terms of where we have got to. And whilst it's limited to England only, the overall trends shown here are broadly similar across other parts of the UK, and indeed many other countries throughout the world. And so in 2020 then, cars represented 58% of trips and accounted for 81% of miles travelled. And so in other words, cars were by far the most popular mode of travel in 2020. Now encouragingly, walking was the next most popular, with a trip share of 32%, but only a distance share of 5%. And cycling, as the other major form of active mode captured in the survey, accounted for just 3% of trips and 2% of miles travelled. Now you may be thinking 2020 is the year of COVID, of course, and this impacted travel enormously. And whilst that's true, as we know, The equivalent National Travel Survey numbers for 2019 actually show quite a similar story here. So the car dominates our modal choices, and as a result, it also dominates our spaces, clogging our roads, causing severe congestion, and clogging our public areas, taking up valuable room which could be used in other ways. Indeed, on average, the car is used very little for its intended purpose, that is, moving people around. The vast majority of the time, cars are stationary, whether parked outside people's homes or parked elsewhere. And so this represents a huge inefficiency. And further adding to that inefficiency, for the 5% of the time when cars are actually being driven, the vast majority of those trips are under 5 miles, and around 20% of trips are between 5 and 10 miles. And so at least when considered on this distance basis, these trips seem to have good potential to be shifted onto other modes. If we further unpick this data, looking at the modal share for those low distance trips, we can see from this chart from the National Travel Survey again that the vast majority of all trips between 1 and 10 miles are driven. So particularly for the trips between 1 and 5 miles, this shows there's latent potential for doing something different. Now, we talked about what the current transport system looks like in terms of fleet sizes and modal share, but what is the impact of all this really? Well, let's now reflect on some other numbers which add to this picture of today's transport system. So first up is 27%. That's the contribution of transport to the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. Next is 4.2 million. That's the number of premature deaths per year worldwide due to air pollution. 7 billion is the annual cost to the UK economy, which results from traffic congestion. And 1.35 million, that's the number of deaths per year worldwide due to road traffic collisions. Of course, the statistic particularly important given this is the Festival of Road Safety after all. And here is today's reality in picture form. This is an illustration from Carl Gilg, which was commissioned by the Swedish Road Administration. A powerful image really, which I think perfectly captures the absurdity of the car-centric world we live in. Now, I've utilised some big numbers here and a deliberately dramatic image to make a point. And of course, these things don't portray anything about the tremendous progress we've made in many areas across transport, including in transport safety. But nevertheless, it's clear our transport system is not performing as well as it should be. And we're now at a pivotal moment when we need big change again. And remember, as we saw before, we know that change is possible. So where do we need to go next? How do we instigate change? So here I would like to argue a case for thinking small. And by thinking small, I mean giving sufficient focus on two issues in particular. First is on increasing our access to and use of smaller vehicles, which can provide a more efficient personal transport solution, at least for a substantial portion of short trips. And second, decreasing the sheer volume of big vehicles on the roads, which, as we learned, spend around 95% of the time parked and the majority of the rest of the time used for short distance trips, where actually the size, the power, the range of that vehicle may not actually be required to meet the needs of that journey. So to give you some tangible examples of this thinking small, I'll talk through three categories of innovation which align with the approach. The first category is personal mobility devices, often also referred to as micromobility. Now, PMDs are a very broad category of small vehicles. For all intents and purposes, this covers small, lightweight, typically electric powered vehicles which have particular potential for capturing that market share from short journeys. Within this category, we have e-bikes, and that includes electric pedal assisted cycles and more powerful models which are type approved under L category regulations. We also have seated and standing e-scooters, self-balancing personal transporters, hoverboards, electric unicycles, electric skateboards and one-wheel boards, and lots of other things not mentioned here, I'm sure. On the periphery, I've also included micro cars, which, while similar in form factor to the traditional car, here the small size, electric power, lightweight design are closely aligned with micromobility. Now, in a recent review for the European Commission, TRL identified a vast number of these personal mobility devices on the market, and with a vast array of technical specifications. And I'm not suggesting here that all of them are suitable technologies for integration with our transport system. Indeed, there are a number of very important safety issues which must be considered and addressed for many of these devices. But instead, I would argue that these technologies warrant further attention. The benefits are already proven for some. For example, there's a wide evidence base in the literature outlining the many environmental, health, social benefits of e-bikes, and those have an appropriate regulatory system which is in place to drive high standards of vehicle safety. But for the other modes, the other types of technologies here, evidence is more lacking, and an unregulated market is generally leading to large variability in design quality. And so this gap must be filled. The next category I'd like to talk about is what I've called delivery devices. So again, overlap here with micromobility, and in essence these are again small, lightweight, typically electrically powered vehicles which are capable of making those short journeys, and generally with low maximum speeds, perhaps up to about 30 miles an hour, but with some exceptions. And these devices are focused on the movement of goods rather than the movement of people, and in particular tackling that last mile delivery challenge. So within this category we have again a form of bicycle in the e-cargo bike, along with other innovations in various forms of development, including powered trolleys, drones, delivery robots and autonomous pods. All of these technologies share a common objective of reducing the need for those traditional larger cars, vans, trucks to complete that last mile leg of the logistics journey. And by thinking smaller, the widespread use of these types of technologies has potential to reduce those negative impacts of motor vehicle deliveries on emissions, air quality, congestion. And from a safety perspective, the smaller profiles, the lower weights, the lower speeds of these types of vehicles can too bring benefits in the form of reduced injury risk for road users. However, many of these modes also bring new safety challenges, which must be overcome, of course, to enable that widespread rollout. So for autonomous delivery robots and pods, that underlying automation system has got to be assessed against the highest safety standards to prevent unsafe behaviours. And for drones, for example, we must ensure that they can not only avoid collisions when in the sky, but also that they're able to transition from air to ground and back again safely without presenting risks to the road users or the goods recipients. And if drones are to be flown autonomously, this again requires that automated system to be able to handle all eventualities with the lowest risk response. And the last example of thinking small I wanted to raise is shared mobility. So again, a broad category here, but fundamentally it's about enabling more efficient use of vehicles. And by encouraging a shift towards usership rather than ownership, and shared assets rather than privately owned assets, we can enable reductions in the volume of privately owned vehicles, which is a key part of this thinking small idea. Now, shared mobility as a model can be applied for multiple modes, of course, from car clubs to van sharing, to bike, scooter, e-cargo bike sharing schemes and so on. And car clubs have particularly important to this discussion, as whilst I've raised a great number of challenges associated with our current car dominance, it would be foolhardy to think we could completely abolish the need for cars at all. And so car sharing enables a more efficient use of giving people access to the cars they inevitably will need for some journeys. Car sharing is available around the UK today. It's most commonly in densely populated cities, predominantly in London. And the benefits are also well evidenced, from aiding decarbonisation to increasing active travel and health benefits, bringing financial savings for the consumer, and reducing parking, construction and maintenance costs for local authorities, for example. It provides one of the most straightforward alternatives to the private car in theory, but overall this car share market is still in its infancy, and despite that nationwide coverage of car share schemes, overall the numbers of shared vehicles and uptake by users remains low in the UK. And so really more work is needed here to stimulate uptake of car sharing and of shared mobility in general. So how do we ensure that the benefits of these innovations and others are not talked about here are actually realised, and at the same time that the challenges and risks associated with them are also mitigated? Well, broadly we need actions across three areas. So firstly, supportive policy and regulation is needed. For many of the categories of micro vehicle discussed here, for example, the legal frameworks which they're governed by are currently stunting growth and progression. So for example, e-scooters are classed as motor vehicles, requiring type approval, registration, insurance and a minimum age and licence to qualify to operate one. And whilst the trials of shared e-scooters are underway through a legal exemption to these privately owned e-scooters remain illegal by default, since they do not meet the requirements set under this motor vehicle regulation. And from a safety perspective, it's crucial that clear regulations are developed which not only clarify those operational road rules for e-scooters and other PMDs, but also that they set minimum technical standards to alleviate safety concerns associated with poor quality or inappropriate vehicle design. And crucially, we need strong evidence to form the basis of these regulations and standards. Next, our built environment must be conducive to support accelerated shifts away from private motor vehicles and onto other smaller alternatives. As we saw in the 20th century with the mass motorisation of our transport system, rollout of a robust road network was critical to the success of the motor vehicle. But in turn, this led us down the garden path to the situation we now face, where a radical overhaul is required to capture valuable land back from the car and repurpose it in ways which enables safe use of smaller alternatives, particularly in our towns and cities. Today we have roads, cycle lanes, footways. We know we need more cycle lanes and better quality cycle lanes, and we need more spaces for pedestrians. Do we also need dedicated spaces for delivery robots? Do we need wider lanes for e-cargo bikes? Do we need safe landing spots for delivery drones? How do we ensure that the infrastructure being built today optimises the safety for the more varied mix of road users that we will require tomorrow? These are urgent questions which must be addressed. And lastly, it's really important that we recognise it's not all about new technologies. We can produce smaller vehicles, but if people don't use them, then no benefits will be realised. Likewise, to achieve a smaller fleet of vehicles, we must convince a substantial proportion of the population to give up their vehicles, or at the very least to use them much less. And so behaviour is also key. It's key from a safety perspective too. As we shift towards this new mix of transport modes, particularly one which will be dominated by smaller vehicles with, for example, less physical protection surrounding the occupants, we must therefore ensure that the right behaviours are encouraged to minimise risks to all types of road users. So to close the presentation then, I'll summarise with 4 points. Number one, we've seen pivotal moments in the transport industry before, and so we know significant change is possible. Number two, our transport system is currently suboptimal. It's not working as well as it should, and it's causing a great number of harms to society, the economy and the environment. We need to harness another pivotal moment, and we need to do it right now. Number three, in shaping our future transport system, we should be thinking smaller. And by that I mean giving considerable effort to increasing the use, safety, efficiency and effectiveness of smaller vehicles, moving away from the traditional automotive designs, and coupled with equally considerable effort to decreasing the volume of vehicles on our roads, full stop. And number four, while it's straightforward to think smaller, delivering smaller is harder work. And so to enable these substantial changes, we need to do a number of things. Addressing the current gaps in policy and regulation, having coordinated infrastructure investment, and delivering comprehensive behaviour change programmes. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening. My contact details are on screen. Should you wish to do so, please feel free to get in touch. Many thanks and goodbye.